Though I have now travelled the Sussex Downs upwards of 30 years, yet I still investigate that chain of majestic mountains with fresh admiration year by year, and think I see new beauties every time I traverse it. As you pass along, you command a noble view of the Wild or Weald on one hand, and the broad downs and sea on the other.
Gilbert White was one of the first naturalists. Writing about natural history in the 18th century, he gave particular, vivid and accurate descriptions of nature with dates and locations. He was an important influence on Charles Darwin, and David Attenborough has also spoken of his huge influence on him. His seminal work, The Natural History of Selborne, cuts across the local landscape, across literature and natural history. This exhibition was created in the context of forest fires in the Amazon and the Australian outback, and protests in the streets of cities around the world by Extinction Rebellion. And we really need to think about these issues, and this is something that Gilbert White was doing back in the 18th century. He was thinking about the importance of nature. He was already writing about species that had been lost through the impact of mankind. Artists through the centuries, right up to the ones we have commissioned, have been drawn to motifs and subjects he has written about. That continuity has been exciting to bring together. The very first exhibit in the exhibition is the first edition from 1789 of Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne. We were delighted to be able to borrow an original copy of this very rare book from the Earl and Countess of Selborne. It's laid out in the exhibition with the cover open and a fold-out engraving by the Swiss artist Samuel Hieronymus Grimm. He came to Britain in the 18th century. You can see the whole village of Selborne with figures in the foreground. Looking down the hillside is Selborne Church, and beyond to the hangar and the zigzag path on the hillside with Gilbert White's little hermitage. The first edition of the book contains an illustration of a curious bird by the 18th century game painter Stephen Elmer. Gilbert White commissioned this to illustrate the plumage and the colouring of this extraordinary bird. Subsequent editions of the natural history moved more to focus on the birds and animals. The wood engraver Thomas Bewick had a strong affinity with Gilbert White's writing. He was perhaps the greatest illustrator of birds in the 18th century, and some of the later editions in the 19th century included wood engravings made after his original prints. By the 20th century, we saw wonderful examples of arts and craft illustrations by Edmund Hort New. Every single chapter opening has a distinctive letterform surrounded by birds and animals. Harvest mice have a particular importance to the writings of Gilbert White because he was the first naturalist to name and identify them, and his wonderful description of their habitats has caught the attention of quite a few of the artists over the years.
From the colour, shape and size and manner of nesting, I made no doubt that the species is nondescript. They never enter into houses, are carried into ricks and barns with the sheaves, abound in harvest, and build their nest amidst the straws of the corn above the ground, and sometimes in thistles.
From the 1920s, there was a real interest in rural life and in nature, and a lot of artists and writers began to look at the writings of Gilbert White. In 1929, there was an edition illustrated by Eric Fitch Daglish. Within his edition of the book are original tint types. A tint type is a very fine wood engraving tool which is not about the thickness of the line but the quantity of thin marks. His illustrations are on very thin Japanese paper and feature a number of birds and also the much-loved Timothy the tortoise, who is one of the most memorable characters in Gilbert White's writings. The story of Timothy starts in Chichester when Gilbert White's uncle had bought him from a sailor. Timothy the tortoise was living in the garden of Gilbert White's Aunt Rebecca at Ringmer, and he was particularly interested in his hibernation habits.
The old Sussex tortoise that I have mentioned to you so often is become my property. I dug it out of its winter dormitory in March last, when it was enough awakened to express its resentments by hissing, and packing it in a box with earth, carried it 80 miles in post-chaise. The rattle and hurry of the journey so perfectly roused it that when I turned it out on a border, it walked twice down to the bottom of my garden. However, in the evening, the weather being cold, it buried itself in the loose mould and continues still concealed.
Many of the contemporary artists, such as Alice Petullo and Emily Sutton, have such an affection for this tortoise and his character, and none more so than Christopher Brown, who was introduced to Gilbert White by his tutor, Edward Borden, who was a contemporary of Revilius.
I love tortoises, and I couldn't resist doing the piece about the tortoise and him sort of grubbing himself up, after his winter's hibernation. And it so remembers, my tortoise that used to disappear and we could never find him, and then later on we would find him and bring him in. I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing about his writing. It's never dull, it's very readable. You've given the book to X number of illustrators, printmakers, and they've probably all chosen a different passage because it's something they are interested in and something that we can all relate to, whether it's the changing landscape, migratory birds, insects, whatever, the seasons. I think for each one of us, there's something different within that book.
In the early 1930s, Gertrude Hermes was commissioned by the Grugannagh Press in Wales to produce an edition of the book. She made a number of large wood engravings and stayed in the village to get a sense of the atmosphere. The images she created had a sense of menace in them, like this extraordinary image of the deer looking straight out and these bats and striking spider.
Every day, in autumn chiefly, do I see those spiders shooting out their webs and mounting aloft. What I most wondered at was that it went off with considerable velocity in a place where no air was stirring, and I am sure I did not assist it with my breath.
In 1937, the Sussex-based artist Eric Ravilious was commissioned to produce illustrations for a new edition. Ravilious loved the writings of Gilbert White and was drawn to the atmosphere of village life. He had a real sense of warmth and of humour, and he was drawn to some of the stories, such as the Duke of Richmond's moose.
I found it in an old greenhouse, slung under the belly and chin by ropes and in a standing posture. But though it had been dead for so short a time, it was so putrid in state, the stench was hardly supportable.
One of the particular discoveries in the exhibition is the artist Claire Oldham. I searched for her family history and discovered that she was actually the niece of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes. I also found out that she lived not far from Chichester in the South Downs, and that she produced a number of illustrated books. It's such a discovery to find an artist you've never heard of before producing really wonderful works. And these have such an elegance to them. This swooping of the birds, the forms of a group of hedgehogs gathering together. There are 10 women artists within the exhibition, and there's a particular strength in their depictions of nature. I think wood engraving as a form of printmaking in which women particularly excelled, and I think what's also very interesting about this is a technique of printmaking which requires great skill and also strength.
I mean, I don't work that large, but I don't use machines, so it's all me, force and guile. I'm really interested in pebbles and their journey of reduction, so I started thinking about birds and the red list of birds that are becoming extinct or in decline, and there's a lot of them. So I found pebbles that were suitable for the scale of the birds that I wanted to kind of commemorate. So I was carving the words in raised letters around the outside of the pebbles, then hollowing out the pebbles and intertwining them with things like oak moss and feathers, twigs. I mean, they're hellish to carve. They literally spark when I'm carving them. They're actually horrible, but I've loved the actual end result so much that I'm prepared to give my elbows up for them. I'm hopefully inviting other people to pay attention to things, and I think that's something that Gilbert White wanted to do. You know, he wrote letters. I mean, I write letters. Communicating your passion and asking questions. You know, those connections I think are really vital, and that is something that I think is a really big part of what I enjoy about my work. I also decided I wanted to do a large print for the show, and I really wanted to talk about the hibernaculum. You know, often when I'm walking with the whippets, there's, you know, all the foxholes and badger holes and rabbits, and I really loved the idea that these birds were kind of spinning round, and rather than being set free, that they would end up going into, you know, a hole in the middle of the head. And hibernaculum is just the hibernation hole that Gilbert White was suggesting all animals disappeared into that didn't migrate.
The brief that I gave to each of the artists was to think about the writings and the subjects in the book and some of the stories, and to come up with their own interpretation. These range from watercolours by Emily Sutton, to wood engravings by Angie Lewin and Neil Boosfield, to screen prints by Alice Bichulo. Mark Hurld has become known in the last few years for his extraordinary collages and paintings of birds and animals. He chose to depict the most unusual birds, the hoopoes. These were also a subject for Michael Kirkman in a completely different process, through lino cutting. It's fascinating to see how different artists have been inspired by exactly the same piece of writing to create quite different works.
Gilbert White and I go hand in hand in when you really look at something, then you do learn to care about it, and then when you care about it, then we have a chance to make sure that you know, things continue, and I think that's really vital at the moment. So I'm hopefully inviting other people to pay attention to things, and I think that's something that, you know, Gilbert White wanted to do.
It has been wonderful to be able to mark the 300th anniversary of Gilbert White this year, but also to show how artists have a role to play in bringing our attention to nature, to the natural world, which is at risk from environmental change. And I think there's also something very hopeful about these images. They have joy within them, and they are recording something important as we look to the future.
As the length of my correspondence has sufficiently put your patience to the test, I shall take here a respectful leave of you and natural history. With all due deference and regard, your most obliged and most humble servant, Gilbert White.